I am here on a podcast with Michael, also part of the Parlay magazine crew, writer of Finality. The point of this podcast is to make art a little more accessible and for people to explain the inspiration and kind of how they write their pieces. So let's start with, how did you get into writing? How did you start writing?
I'm mostly creative writing as a hobby, right? I'm primarily a psych student here at FLC, but there's still, I consume normally a lot of media where I'm seeing these very story-driven narratives, and I look at these and I'm like, I'd love to be able to write like that. It's really interesting seeing these stories fleshed out and seeing all this effort be put into them and then the fruit that's born from that. So I've been taking that, and I've mostly not written anything, but I've done a lot of thought process behind it, combined with the fact that I play a lot of tabletop, so I'm still writing also stories for them. So I'm making character stories. I'm making worlds that people are in.
That's awesome. I've met a lot of people who've gotten their start through D&D and role-playing type activities. Seems like a very good way to get kind of used to storytelling aspects.
Yeah, because you're pulling yourself out of all of your life experiences and creating new life experiences, right? You're seeing yourself or through a different lens, and you're able to kind of make stories from other people and other stories.
Yeah, that is a very good way to look at it, because art is very inspired by life, I would say. And especially in, modern day with media and such, it's very easy to find inspiration in other people's lives. But you do have to look to your life as well. And it is really cool to have outlets like D&D and role-playing to kind of, find inspiration in your own life.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. What was the inspiration for this piece?
So a lot of this, without going too much into a lot of what's happening in the world today, I've kind of been looking at what causes a society to fall, right? Mm-hmm. What has been a kind of reoccurring theme through a large amount of societies, and how have these societies begun to crumble, which this was already a component kind of running through my mind. And then I recently played Transistor by Supergiant Games, and the entire talk of that is kind of the death of individuality, and how as we become more and more just a single identity across a culture rather than our own individual identities, how more and more that goes to death. And obviously there's certain levels of that, right? Because we have like collectivist cultures such as East Asian cultures, and they have their own thing that makes it work. But that's also because they're not an individualistic culture to start with. So they have their own themes, and this is what they're used to, compared to a society like ours where we greatly value one's own identity, despite the fact that we're actively killing it.
Right, yeah. You can kind of lose oneself in an individualistic culture, I've found. I feel like art from the East is really exploding right now. And I feel like the collectivistic culture might have something to do with why there's so many, up and coming artists over there, and just like the quality of art. But that's awesome. Yeah.
Yeah.
What about your writing process for the piece? Like, how did you go about it?
Funny thing, I kind of wrote this piece in like 15 minutes. But I'd been thinking about this for a while, and I kind of been thinking about, how do you show people physically losing their identities, right? Because that's easily the biggest thing. We have all these first impressions. We immediately see someone and are able to make tons of conclusion about them, whether they're right or wrong. So that was kind of the immediate thing to me, was what is the vaguest possible like physical body you can make? What is the most, I can't tell anything from that? And to me, that was this kind of baggy clothing that doesn't show a figure, faces hidden, all of this, because suddenly you can't make impressions because there's nothing discernible about a person.
Yeah, that is a really good way of going about it. And I find that like fashion a lot nowadays is about kind of baggier clothing, kind of almost hiding your actual self.
Yeah.
And that really reflects in your piece, which I really like. But yeah, that's awesome. And it also, I tend to write my pieces in very short bursts of time, just because I feel like it's really easy to get the exact emotion you want when you're doing it right when you're feeling that emotion.
Yeah.
And I really think that's a cool way of doing it. Yeah.
Yeah. It definitely works for short fiction more than long fiction.
Yeah.
But for short fiction, yeah, because it's very emotionally moved, right? So seeing that immediate emotional bursts, even afterwards as it's edited and then seeing kind of general proofreading and stuff, you're still feeling a burst of emotion that is different than what you're getting with longer pieces.
Right, yeah. I wonder if it's because I've always had trouble writing longer pieces, but I wonder if there's a way to kind of combine those short 15-minute bursts into like all one piece,
Yeah.
I feel like that'd be a really interesting thing. What about some of the wording you use? It kind of switches from, referring to the main character as she to they to it. Could you explain how that kind of goes into almost depersonalizing them?
Yeah. So, I mean, first off, let me open with, I know non-binary people are a thing. I'm not using they, them as a way of kind of not, I'm using it in a way that is making it no assumptions about gender, but I'm also aware that for people, it is a gender. I feel like that's something I should just immediately put on the table.
Right, yeah.
But it's kind of this, right? Like we have such an identity on gender. We have all these kind of preconceived notions. We have gender roles and all this. And she's already, right, like there's no necessarily gender roles made about her immediately, though you see kind of feminine qualities like this long black hair, the dress. So you immediately kind of get those. But then as the story's going on, you see these qualities less and less because of the fact that as she's slowly depersonalizing, you're seeing less and less gender identity, which is then going into the they, them, because again, I'm aware that for some people, they, them is a gender, but it also can be used in the sense of, just a vague description of a person not wanting to assume gender. And that's what it's kind of going into with her no longer being discernible as a person, which then transitions to at the very end with it kind of this monster of the entire group as a whole. And that's that it, because it's no longer any individual person in there.
Yeah, that's a really good way of doing it. Having that one big group just be an it, because it kind of almost makes you fear that big group. Makes it almost seem like, I don't know, something that's most definitely not individual. Or, yeah.
That actually, that spawned from, I don't remember the exact name of an article, but it was a article talking about one of the first mega malls that opened up in the US. And the writer of it is kind of going through the mall and talking about every single very clear red flag. He compares it to casinos with how there's no clocks inside. He talks about how there's a bunch of like underpaid migrant workers working a lot of the menial jobs. And in the end, he's on the roof of the building and, he's talking about all the surroundings, but he ends with, there's this big glass roof over the like entrance to the mall. And I don't remember the exact quote he uses, but it's along the lines of, from up there through the glass window, I saw my peers walk into the belly of the beast.
Wow.
So that's kind of the idea I got it from, because it's using that same like monstrosity idea to something that we almost normalize.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, that's a really good inspiration for that. That's super cool. What about the title, Finality? How does that play into the overall?
I wanted to do Finality because, again, this whole thing spawned from this kind of death of a society, death of a civilization. And that's why I went with that, because I wanted this to almost, even though it has a vague ending, it's still a representation of the end, right? Like this person, the woman no longer feels like a person. There's nothing there that makes it discernible. All the color is gone. That was only present in the first paragraph and then a little bit at the second. And that's kind of what this finality is going to, is this is the end. This is where everything is falling apart.
Yeah. there's a lot of really good imagery in there, especially with the color. Could you walk me through like how you thought of that imagery and, you know, how the color changes throughout the...
Yeah. From the beginning, there's not too much color, but you have some mentions like how there's the neon lights that the water is shining through. And it's kind of showing, again, this very, like, not civilized, individualistic culture, and how there's a lot of bright lights. There's a lot of very discernible things. And you have already some mention of the lack of color, but it's not anything immediately like worrying, because like all other colors, black's a color. And then when you get to the second paragraph, you start having more dull coloring. It's dim light. It's brown finish, right? There's not any mention of color outside of more monotone colors, but it's still not quite exclusively monochrome colors. So you have this kind of sense of there's still a color if dulled, which then in the last paragraph, that's all gone, right? There's only this monochrome color where suddenly all absence of any sort of lights, any sort of bright coloring to help make it feel alive, and it feels almost empty.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, almost as if when you lose the individual, you kind of start to lose everything else. Everything starts to merge and become the same.
Yeah.
I think that color is a really good way of showing it, have everything, you know, kind of become the same color, become the same idea. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's really awesome. Were there any like specific sources you looked at for your imagery?
No. I use some references like when I was talking about the writhing black mass at the end, but most of this was kind of my own just visualizing the piece, and then how do I take my own images and then write them.
Mm-hmm. That's super cool. Yeah. Wonderful piece.
Thank you.
Loved it. Yeah. I hope to see more from you.
Yeah, I will probably submit for next Parlay magazine, so look forward to it.
Awesome. Do you have any other pieces you're writing, or are you looking to submit to any other magazines?
Not currently, but that will change.
Awesome. Well, good talking to you.
Yeah,
nice little
thank you for having me here.
Yeah, of course. Thank you very much.